Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We have been wandering in the wilderness for what seems like an endless amount of time. We haven't always managed this journey particularly well. Some of us are pretty miffed at a small minority who can't seem to follow the rules, even though the directions appear fairly clear and straightforward. If we had all been on the same page, we would have gotten through this by now, instead of circling around and around, holding up our progress. But at the same time, we must be compassionate. There's a lot of information being put out all at once, and some of it seems directly contradictory. There are forces outside of our control that makes what was already plenty difficult even harder. We stand on the edge of a new chapter, but we aren't sure what the next step will bring, what new complications await us that we can't even imagine, and what same issues will follow us, refusing to disappear no matter where we stand. Yes, I have actually been talking about the Torah portion all this time. That was a basic summary of Parshat Eikev. But isn't it amazing how an ancient text over 2,000 years old seems to meet us where we are in the 21st century? One of my very favorite things about Torah, and apologies to those who may have heard me repeat this over and over, but that's the point, is that we feel Jewish time largely as a circle. The seasons and the holidays repeat. We read the same Torah portion over and over again. Yet as we keep moving forward through time, we realize that our experience is not two-dimensional, a circle, as it were. It's three-dimensional. Jewish time is a corkscrew. Every tradition repeats, but we are never the same as we meet it. Another Shabbat Eikev means another year in our lives have passed, and after each year, especially this one, we are not the same person. Parshat Eikev knows how we feel. In this section of Deuteronomy, Moses continues to retell the story of how we got here on the brink of the promised land, taking the opportunity to use our history as opening to what we should learn from each episode. What are the laws and lessons we might derive for when we take the next step without him? Still the chosen people, or the people who choose to make these choices Jewish, but in a new landscape with new leadership. Moses says, "V'zacharta et kol haderech asher holicha Adonai Elohecha, ze 40 shana bamidbar." Remember the long way that Adonai your God has made you travel in the wilderness these past 40 years, that God might test you by hardships to learn what was in your heart, whether you would keep God's commandments or not. This is a complicated verse to interpret in our day. We might immediately resonate with Moses' logic, kind of an everything happens for a reason approach. This is an important touchstone many of us hold. When life is chaotic, filled with curses instead of blessings, or simply deeply unfair, as it often is, this mantra may bring us comfort. God tested you with hardships to learn what was in your hearts. There is a larger plan at work. These trials that I've lived through, this wilderness I have wandered, it's all an opportunity for me to learn from God or learn for myself a deeper lesson about life. But I'll be honest, my friends, on some days that works for me and on some days it doesn't. On some days I simply don't see or don't agree that there's a lesson in the suffering of the world. And I think that's okay. On those days, I'm not satisfied with that answer, and I can choose to seek another one. This time around, when I read Parshat Eikev, I feel myself directly in the shoes of a person who is remembering a long way home. I was drawn to a different interpretation of this line by Ghizkuni, a classical French commentator from the 13th century. He writes, "V'zachartem et kol haderech, you will remember the whole journey if your heart urges you to covet the gold and silver, which are part of the idols of other nations. I remind you of the last 40 years in the desert when you had no need for, nor even use for, gold and silver." In Parshat Eikev as a whole, there's a constant preoccupation with abundance and scarcity. This line about remembering the journey we are focusing on is followed by this. When you have eaten your fill and built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, beware, lest your heart grow haughty, and you forget Adonai your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, in order to test you by hardships, only to benefit you in the end. And you say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand have won this wealth for me. Remember that it is Adonai your God who gives you the power. Hizkuni is drawing our attention to a different and equally valid reason that we must remember the hardship of the journey. God says, it will not always be like this. You have lived through hard times. You may yet live through good ones and then hard ones once again. Remember what's really important when not everything is up to you. I love this more contemporary interpretation on the same themes of Eikev by Rabbi Shefa Gold, who's also the composer of many melodies we treasure here at CBST. She writes, it is possible to eat everything in sight and say 100 blessings a day in perfect Hebrew and yet remain unsatisfied. The spiritual challenge of Eikev is to break the spell of consumerism whose power rests in our continual dissatisfaction. As you enter the land of your life, a land of fountains and depths, valleys and hills, shopping malls and glossy catalogs, a land of wheat and barley, television commercials and billboards and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a place of comforts and the illusion of security. You are in mortal danger of forgetting where all these gifts come from. It will seem to you that you made this life for yourself, that you are the creator. And here is the spiritual challenge of Eikev. How do I discern between self-destructive greed and a true, healthy appetite for pleasure that allows the blessing of satisfaction to manifest? We, all of us, have lived with so little for so long, so little human touch, so little ability to see places outside our familiar walls, so little confidence that we are truly safe from an invisible danger. But as we enter a time of relative abundance, a time when we have the possibility of more instead of less, let us not block out the lessons of our long wilderness journey because finally we can. Let it make us mindful and appreciative of what we have. Let it remind us to always give thanks and never leave love unspoken. In the wilderness, the children of Israel had plenty of gold and silver that they brought from Egypt, but it was worthless. They couldn't eat it. There wasn't anything to buy or sell with it. It had no value as currency. But it served a sacred purpose when everyone contributed it to the Mishkan, a beautiful communal project to create a place for God to reside. We likely have much more clarity on what is actually important to us, what gives us true pleasure and satisfaction after the past year that we've lived through together. Let us take the opportunity to center it in our lives as we approach a new year. If we have more abundance and more choice, let our journey remind us to choose wisely what has proven to be essential. Even in our times of scarcity, let us not forget what it means to be generous. And may we know satisfaction and gratitude in those moments and in all the ones in between. Shabbat Shalom.